My name is Aldrich, and I'll be talking a little bit about how important homeschoolers and unschoolers are, not just to other homeschoolers and unschoolers, but as an educational movement that is transformative. I do want to say that the national, internationally, the concept of education is in a really bad spot right now. And what I find so absolutely fascinating about homeschooling and unschooling is it is driving the first education reform movement. It doesn't actually require education to reform for it to work. And as we look at corporations, and again, I spend as much time working with and looking at large corporations as I do with startups, as I do with government agencies, no monopoly has ever reformed itself. And there's a reason why schools have continued to fail to do what is right. It's pretty obvious in our school system. We're often first asked to accept things that are clearly stupid, and then we're asked to praise the few people who say these things are stupid, and then, see, and there. Third, we don't expect anything to actually change and likely get worse. So we really are in a bad place when it comes to schools being adaptive. So again, my name is Aldrich. I've written a handful of books, mostly around the concept of educational simulations and serious games. And this put me into contact with a tremendous amount of people, including people from top schools like Harvard, top other learning organizations like the U.S. Army and other government agencies, nonprofits. I've worked with almost every type of organization imaginable with a very interesting and very specific lens of saying, how do we turn your content into something that is interactive? How do we turn something from a learning to know experience to a learning to do experience? And in that process, when applying that lens, a tremendous amount of the cracks that are in our school system and that are very baked into the way we present content have come forth. I've also been a summer camp counselor. Again, I've built a lot of educational simulations and serious games, written far too many books. I work with a lot of organizations. I even work with ETS in terms of rethinking some of the formalized assessment methodologies. So I come at this not as someone who is purely critical, but someone who's also trying to work in various ways to make things better. So first thing is, what has changed? Why is the world different than it was, say, 5, 10, 15 years ago? One concept, of course, is more content is now free, and almost all content is now fluid. There's simply, in the olden days, you had to go to the library to get information. And again, the other thing is content is fluid. It's very easy to switch platforms, to have access to all this information. So we live in this world where information has gone from the scarcest thing possible, where people have to raise money to build libraries, to stuff where a lot of content is free, or at the very least, very fluid. Another thing, a lot of role modeling master's programs, including some for-profits, have gotten very, very good, very virtual, and very disintermediating. The notion of MBAs requiring even college degrees is going away, as well as high school degrees. So again, the notion of more of an education marketplace is forming at the highest levels. It's been a fascinating thing for me looking at this whole industry, that in a lot of cases, master's programs, because they have the most contact with the real world, have gotten much more interesting, much greater use of adaptive learning technologies than, say, kindergarten or first grade or second grade, where you kind of hope that people will be more innovative, but in fact have not been. Third thing that's changed, students are simply less tolerant of long stretches of boredom than they were before, so students themselves are changing at a faster level. I guess the big thing that is simply here, and this is just a little bit of a preamble, so to speak, is there's the rate of change in the world, and then there's the rate of change in the school system. And almost no matter what you say, no matter how else you frame it, and it does not even matter when this point is. At some point, and maybe it's always been the case, and maybe this point was 200 years ago, but at some point, the rate of change in the world has outstripped the rate of change in the school system. School systems are very, very hard to change, not because the people who are running them are bad, or not because the government officials who monitor them are bad. It's just simply a very hard mechanism to change. And so given that, you're seeing this increased delta, it's supposed to be a triangle, between the rate of change in the world and the rate of change in schools, and that's only going to grow. So this gap, this delta between what schools are and what the world requires is only going to grow bigger and bigger. Final thing, too, is the cost of schools. The cost of schools continue to rise faster. Nothing gets homeschoolers and unschoolers madder than having to pay their property taxes, realizing how much of it is going to school systems. The cost of schools are going up and up and up. And there's going to be a lot of impacts to that, including really weird cost control methods that are going to be put in place very soon. You're going to have more and more municipalities, even cities going bankrupt, frankly, because of school costs, although they won't call them that. So, we're in this environment. So when you mix all this stuff together, when you mix it up into the big pot and look at schools traditionally, we're going to see higher students to teacher ratios. That's going to continue. We're going to see the greater standardization of curriculum. The PARC effort has been criticized, I believe personally unfairly, but we're still going to see a greater standardization of curriculum, a greater role of standardized assessments even more. Increased disintermediation of parents and businesses. In other words, if you're a parent, drop off your kid and shut up. If you're a business, please give us money, but beyond that, we don't really need that much more from you. We're going to see greater cuts in school budgets, decrease in non-school free time for students. We are going to see an increase in online learning. Number of high school students in the U.S. who fail out, now 30% will go up. Number of U.S. college students who not graduate, now 46 will go up. So in my quick assessment, schools are in a lot of trouble. When I look at a lot of school systems today as an outsider coming in, there's a sweet spot. There's an area that schools tend to do pretty well, and they tend to do very well with the top students. Right now, schools are doing very well with science, technology, engineering, and math in terms of investing in programs. There's a lot of really interesting and innovative and great programs for at-risk students. There's some really great and innovative programs for special needs students. But then there's everyone else, and everyone else is basically there to subsidize this core sweet spot of schools. They don't have customized programs. They don't have much investment. They are there in the hopes that they make these core kids sort of more successful. So right now, you have a tremendous amount of limbo with most schools in most school systems. Another observation, because again, I spend as much time looking at corporations as I do at schools, and it's a simple observation that a multinational food corporation would never discover the need for organic, minimally processed, locally grown agriculture on its own, no matter how many PhDs were on the payroll. It is simply not within the philosophy of a Tyson company or a ConAgra or McDonald's or whatever to say, hey, you know what would be a good solution to our food problem if we had more farms and people bought more locally grown food. It simply would never occur to them. Likewise, we really can't look at schools and school supporters and say, oh, they're going to come up with great ideas on their own. They're not. Tyson Foods is going to come up with, better packaged frozen chicken. They're not going to come up with, a lower key organic model. So to the degree that we have or continue to look within school systems or even people who support the school systems as people who come up with solutions is going to be more and more frustrating, as we've already seen. The other very relevant observation is customers tend to have unrealistic expectations of monopoly. Right now, we collectively, we human beings, have unreasonable, unrealistic expectations of schools. In this case, creates this really greater isolation for, in this case, the teachers. They really are asked to do things that they cannot do, and there's no comparison. They can't say, oh, but look how these other people do it, which means they can't learn from other people who are doing things much differently. And again, they're increasingly having to create these facades of what they can and can't do. So, this is, again, not the school's fault, not the teacher's fault. It is simply this notion of unrealistic expectations, which happened of Microsoft, which happened of Standard Oil, which is happening right now of Google. There are simply these unrealistic expectations, and that is core for it. So I was just fascinated at the failure of a lot of these education movements. I worked with David Kearns when he was in charge of Xerox way back when. He wrote a great book, Winning the Brain Race, Smarter Than Anything I'll Ever Write. It was a great book, and it was mostly right, and it didn't have any impact at all. So I just became increasingly fascinated with the notion of, why do so many school reforms fail? So I wanted to look at people, and I wanted to look in this case at the homeschoolers and unschoolers, and the people who have taken sort of entrepreneurial paths over college. And I asked them two basic questions. What did schools do that was absurd, that was stupid, that was idiotic? What did schools not do that was really important that they should do? So if you sort of ask these two questions of homeschoolers and unschoolers, you get a lot of really interesting perspectives. And what I did with Unschooling Rules is just sort of distill those down to a list of 55 ideas and present them. And so that was sort of the notion of unschooling rules. And the basic conclusion, or a basic conclusion, is the future of education is going to be a synthesis between what today's schools are as a thesis and sort of the unschooling movement as the antithesis. And to move ahead in education, we're going to have to figure out a way to bring these two worlds together. Let the unschoolers unschool and the homeschoolers homeschool. Let the school people continue down their death march, but increasingly have back and forth between them, have conversations that happen, have schools learn from unschoolers and get them out of their own rut, which again, you talk to any teacher, you talk to any standardized assessment creator, you talk to any government official, they're all going to tell you, yeah, we're in a giant rut, we don't quite know how to get out of this. So again, they all know the problem is there. No one in schools today thinks that they're going well. Likewise, unschooling has to evolve as well, and figure out how to make this a very synergistic relationship, not such thought of as being such bitter enemies. And again, the future of education is going to require these two things to work together. And just a quick example: the nice thing about unschooling rules is that it is a lens. I heard this actual quote. It's actually in a conference that I put on Serious Games. I heard this person who was grant funded talking about this amazing teacher, and I'll sort of give you his exact verbatim description. Let me tell you about this amazing science teacher. Some of his students were having trouble with the class module on the scientific method. They were failing tests and papers about scientific method. The science teacher then went to meet with these students after school and found them playing the computer game World of Warcraft. These students had charts they had made up in Discovery and World of Warcraft. The science teacher made an incredible discovery. These World of Warcraft playing students were actually applying the scientific method without even knowing about it. So what this great science teacher did was to explain to the students the links between their methodology and the scientific method. From that point on, the students aced that part of the curriculum. Okay, so this is a traditional, boy, what a great teacher, what a great happy story, what a success this is. From my perspective, I almost took it exactly as, I'm sitting there again, I'm presenting this person and I'm grinding my teeth. So for me, I'm hearing going, okay, here's a scenario where, okay, most importantly is the students taught themselves the material on their own way better than the teacher did who failed utterly. Okay, so first of all, teacher failed utterly, kids taught themselves. Secondly, the teacher applied a testing methodology, didn't pick up the fact these kids actually knew this material better than anyone else did. So, okay, failure in teaching, failure in testing methodology to pick it up. The system could have easily failed the students who knew the stuff the best. The teacher's goals and success metrics, the motivation of the teacher was not to make sure the kids learn this stuff, but for the students to do well on tests and papers, not master the material. So why was the teacher even there? The school wrapper around this self-learning probably cost $2,000 or whatever in total costs of resources just to justify this failed instructional methodology, testing methodology. So the more you start seeing the world through sort of an unschooling rules lens, the more you start seeing some of the sort of obvious problems that we're having, again, in terms of methodology, in terms of what success is, and what we should be thinking about. So one thing I've been doing every year is, again, I have a list of 55 unschooling rules. And I look at them because part of my premise is that, and I think it's justifiable, is that we are getting smarter even in schools. And a lot of the ideas that unschoolers have come up with go through these various phases. A lot of the unschooling concepts go from here, crazy talk of saying if you present them to a school system, they say, oh no, that is utterly insane, to maybe, eventually to, oh my God, this is an incredible idea, let's put a lot of money, foundation funding behind it, to let's start implementing this stuff in things like National Science Foundation, to let's make this part of what schools are. And so we're seeing a bubbling up of unschooling concepts, and again, I'm using unschooling rules as a packaging of them as a fixed point in time, and then watching how these rules bubble up. And so it's fascinating to see two things. First of all, they are bubbling up. A lot of the ideas that we thought of as crazy and that unschoolers were doing, 5 years ago are starting to become increasingly mainstream, although none of them are quite yet. So let me take you through sort of some of the scorecard frameworks. So right now, none of the rules that I've written out in unschooling rules are standard operating procedure. So nothing is sort of mainstreamed yet. Some of these concepts in unschooling rules are, and I'm using these numbers are just the numbers of the rules, which just are there for ease sake. If you care about learning, start with food. So we are seeing an appreciation that learning and food are tightly related. on two different grounds. One of them is the process of creating food is sort of the ultimate learning experience, but also the way that you treat food is the way that you treat learning. In most schools, food is thought of as a prefab stuff that's boxed in big stores, that are prepared by low-skilled workers at the point of need and served up to students. Exactly the way that most schools handle food, they actually handle most other forms of learning. And so there is a starting to appreciate the time between these two. One computer and one spreadsheet software equals math curricula, but the best math curricula comes from spreadsheets. If you want to teach your child math, the best way to do that is to start learning how to use a good spreadsheet program, whether Microsoft or whether Google or whatever. All of the things that students actually need to know about math are baked into this, into a spreadsheet, because that's how they've evolved. I'll go into a little more detail. Oh, good, Allison, thank you. Another part of it is computer games. Computer games went from when I first started writing about computer games 10, 12, 15 years ago as being educational models. Obviously, people were nice to me but didn't have any clue at all. But the history of educational computer games has been a very relevant one, from Carmen Sandiego and Oregon Trail, by the way, he just died of dysentery, to Zoo Tycoon, to some of the interesting ones like Food Force or Darfur is Dying, Remission on Cancer, McDonald's video game, a really harsh satire on McDonald's, really, really harsh. I think Minecraft is now being appreciated as a really incredibly powerful engineering tool, obviously things like Foldit as well. So again, we have this incredible history of educational computer games that have grown up and have presented an alternative way of learning. It kind of comes back to some of the early experiments with kittens, and this is just go through really quickly, and again, this is back in the day when we used to do really horrible experiments with kittens. Take that aside for now. We had two cats, one cat here who could walk around, one cat here who was strapped into a gondola. I know. Poor cats. These are actually kittens who had undeveloped visual cortexes. The cat who could walk around and see the stimulation in context to their movement learned about, had eyes that worked properly, had eyes that reacted to movement properly. The same kitten who saw the exact same visual stimulation as the cat who moved, but who was stuck in the gondola, never developed an appropriate visual cortex. In other words, activity and learning is much more important than sitting and listening to content like you're doing now. Sorry about that. The notion of action being a fundamental part of learning has always been there, but again, computer games have allowed us to think about that more. I have a model of learning that, again, a bunch of models, but here's one. I'll sort of take you through it very, very quickly. Let's call it genetic learning for lack of a better word. In the model of genetic learning, you have someone who has sort of initial levels of competence and conviction, and they're given some challenge. Okay, there's the challenge. And what I always measure is resolution and frustration. It's constant tension between the two. Resolution goes up, I feel good about the world, I am successful, and I don't really learn anything, but I get a little pat on the head. I may be given another challenge. And as I see this challenge, my feeling of resolution goes down, I get a little more frustrated, in this case not a whole lot. Failure. I want to do something and I can't. Failure. My frustration here gets a little higher, or my feeling of satisfaction goes down. Try again, usually trying the exact same thing as I tried before. Bang, also failure. And at that point, my frustration is pretty high. Even this graph looks pretty low, but it's pretty high. And this is the moment of learning right here. I mean, to me, all of learning comes to this moment. When I want to do something, I'm motivated to do something, but I can't. I hit a wall, and then at this point, literally the brain evolves or creates mutations of different strategies. When I'm frustrated, now I have to do something. Yes, Adam, welcome. So glad you're here. This frustration leads to mutations. In this case, let's make up some, get a running start, add some strengths, change stride length, whatever. The point is there's some frustration, we evolve, and the more we understand why failure occurred, then we can sort of try different approaches. And in computer games too, even things like trophies can increase the variety and strategies that we then apply. We are successful, or some of our mutations are successful, and then we've learned something. And that's really, to me, the absolute core model of learning is this pattern of self-directed frustration and resolution Computer games understand this brilliantly. Obviously, textbooks do not. Most classrooms do not. I mean, if you were a biotech company in San Francisco right now, this is how you're evolving your genes. You know, you're looking at success patterns. And the notion of mutations through scaffolding, again, is a very predictable one in the biosciences and one that we have to increasingly think of as we think about developing students' behaviors, especially for more complex skills like leadership. Where there are some easy answers and some hard answers. In a lot of cases, what we are teaching people in things like leadership is what not to do as much as what to do. Because again, in all these soft skill areas, there is no easy, there are no easy answers all the time. That's why they're hard skills. Another category which really annoys me, this is the one that really pisses me off the most, sorry about the language, is we're treating some of these things like they're giant thought-leading breakthroughs when they break through to the press. Like, oh my God, tests don't work. Really? Oh, who would have possibly thought such a thing? We know that the way to learn anything is to first to explore it, then to play, then to add rigor. If you want to learn to ride a bicycle, or okay, you want to learn to swim, what you do is you get in the pool and it's scary, it might kill you, or the ocean or something, and then you screw around, you play, you hold your breath, and then eventually you add rigor. Okay, here's a breaststroke, here's a side stroke. We know this. No one is baffled about this. But unless you have exploring and playing, you cannot add rigor. So I can say, if I'm going to teach you calculus, I want to say, how do I get you to explore calculus? How do I get you to play with calculus like a big old sandbox? And then, only then, do we actually add rigor. But the notion of the schools today is all rigor, no exploration and play. How do we make things harder and more serious while not realizing that no one ever learns that way? It is an absolutely, totally unproven learning model. So again, we're in the stage where at least this part of the unschooling observations are in the, oh my God, who could have possibly thought of such a thing? And of course the answer is everyone. In the notion of college, wow, who could have possibly imagined that when you have colleges that rise above the cost of inflation every year for about 30 years, at some point people are going to stop being able to pay for them? Who could have imagined such a crazy thing? So again, right now we're sort of in this college crisis, and again, the good news is it's being acknowledged as a college crisis. The bad news is that it's kind of hard to figure out sort of a good actual solution. But when I look at colleges, I look at it from two different perspectives. I look at it from the supply side and the demand side. From the demand side is who are hiring people and why at the entry level? Is it an entrepreneurship model or an enterprise model? Then I'm looking at supply side of saying, do we believe that there are multiple philosophies of education, or is there one golden path? So back in the olden days, like 10 years ago, large corporations did a lot of the hiring of college graduates. So you have the notion of the indentured graduate. Okay, you leave college with a big debt load, but you also have faith in institutions that you're gonna work your way out of it and pay off your debt and then have a good life. If you start believing increasingly in a diversity of education, but still large corporations are going to be doing the hiring, you're going to get more and more to this portfolio model. It's more important that you have a portfolio of accomplishments than you do have your one golden diploma. However, this whole side is getting really, really challenged, and sort of the entrepreneurship on the demand side is getting more and more powerful. As Leo Laporte on This Week in Tech said, college, a lot of kids know today that in order to have a good job, they have to create it, not expect someone else to hire them for it. So in this case, we have two different models of education. We still have the one golden path, but in this case, the universities have to be a lot more nimble. They don't focus as much on the big diploma. They have to be a lot cheaper, but they serve a variety of purposes. But if you really start believing in the new philosophies of education as there being multiple, and also an entrepreneurship demand side, then we're almost hitting this world of the new existentialism, that there are no rules anymore. There's no path that is going to help you. College now increasingly becomes the hardest no-win decision you ever have to make. There's no right solution to sort of navigating the college thing. Just this morning, this is how current we are, Huffington Post, students' debt may damage grads' lives more than we realize, Gallup finds. I also have what's called the Soviet line theorem, which is a lot of people want to get into the best schools. And as more and more people want to get into the best schools, there's more and more competition. Pretty soon people start thinking, if there's that much competition for the best schools, they must be worth it, because otherwise there wouldn't be so much competition. This is kind of like back in the old Soviet Union, where literally if there's a long line and you were walking by a long line, you stopped and you got into that long line. You didn't even know what was being offered. You didn't even know what's being served. You just know, boy, if there's a long line, I should get in it. And so I think a lot of, even the best schools, let alone a lot of the not so best schools, are having this whole Soviet line theorem, which is, I'm going to do it because it must be valuable, because if it wasn't so valuable, everyone wouldn't be doing it. And I think this is sort of the whole, the whole academic bubble. This is supposed to be a bubble. And my attempt to draw a highlight turned into a little black widow spot. The notion of colleges right now is being rightfully savaged, as it should. Again, don't read all this. These slides will be available later on. Lots of interesting things just very, very recently in the last couple of weeks about, for years we've been telling kids to sit still and pay attention. That's all wrong. In Slate magazine from a couple of days ago. A few days before that, Washington Post. Why so many kids can't sit still in school today. A couple days before that, in The Atlantic, how Finland keeps kids focused through free play. A nice quote, I wasn't sure that the American approach had ever worked very well. My students in the States had always seemed to drag their feet after about 45 minutes in the classroom. This philosophy that unschoolers have always embodied is now sort of like, oh my God, here's this, who would have possibly imagined that putting a bunch of hyperactive kids in a room, making them sit still and listen to someone talk would be a bad idea? Oh my God, amazing. Teachers' portfolios, not transcripts. Increasingly, we have to create for kids records of their accomplishments, not just things. Badges here, badges were hot. Now you hear less about them, but I still think they're incredibly important to figure out how to get the right badges for people. I know a lot of hiring institutions that I work with are hiring based on badges more than diplomas. So really important concept here. Most of the critical skills are not taught in schools. And once again, I think this is being appreciated, but no one knows how to solve this problem. How would you teach entrepreneurship? Well, I know, don't go to school. One realization that unschoolers have had is there are critical skills seldom taught in schools, like leadership, project management, innovation, relationship management, planning long term. Oh yeah, behaving ethically. We forgot to teach that one. Dang. Now, a lot of school organizations are realizing these are important, but they have no methodologies in place. So a school can say leadership is really important, but a school cannot right now say, okay, then in that case we'll teach and test for leadership. They simply don't know how to. And can we really teach some of these? We can make significant progress, but not using the methodologies that we have today. So we'll get into a little bit about some of the approaches that we can teach. We can't not teach them, even though some things like leadership. Let me take this a little more seriously, Allison. I can't teach you leadership, but I can teach you what not to do in leadership. I can teach you, it's easier to teach someone worst practices in leadership. Don't bully people, don't demand results if people don't understand why, whatever. There's a lot of really, really good things not to do. And you can mention me, absolutely. So, and a lot of these there are things like project management where you can teach people how to do things. There's things like innovation where in some cases it is more effective to teach someone what not to do than what to do, and that's a whole different issue, but still important. There are a lot of unschooling principles that I think schools will admit are good ideas, but they also are not realistic. I think we have tremendous curriculum bloat right now, and the notion of reading, writing, and arithmetic actually being the core skills needs to be brought back. Customization. Every single teacher will say customization is important, and very, very few actually know how to do that. Internships, apprenticeships, and interesting jobs beat term papers, textbooks, and tests. If you want to learn something, and again, I've done a lot of work interviewing our top cybersecurity people in both private and government agencies. As I've talked to all of these top cybersecurity people, they say, no, I didn't go to college because college was teaching me all the wrong things. But what did work for me was internships, apprenticeships, interesting jobs, and the other thing I probably should add here are peer-to-peer groups. So if I'm a cybersecurity expert, schools are absolutely useless for me. They teach me the wrong thing because they're too slow. But if I can talk to peers and I can join peer groups, that is how I can learn things. Build more, consume less. The notion of education being a consuming experience, which is what it currently is, versus a building experience is something that's interesting. What a person learns in a classroom is how to be a person in a classroom, blah, blah, blah. So all of these things are starting to be appreciated intellectually, but no one really knows how to implement them outside of an unschooling rules environment. Feed passion and embrace excellence. Again, for all the children, there's something they love more than anything else. How do you allow them to spend the time to feed that passion and embrace their excellence rather than the great mediocrity? Avoid the academic false dichotomy of the cultural literacy track or the vocational track. We're seeing both of these being critical. There is no, gold star versus the brown room. Every single good education needs to combine both vocational and cultural literacy, or more specifically, practical, not just symbolic. Here's a really, really big one that I think is just starting to bubble up. Teaching is leadership. Most teaching is bad leadership. And I think we're understanding the difference between different types of leadership. And I'll be specific here. There's, one type of leadership is directive. Directive is what I'm doing right now. I'm telling you what to do. I need you to believe that I'm smarter than you. By the way, I'm not. I need you to sort of trust me as the authority with all the answers. By the way, I'm not. It's a model of directive leadership, and right now most schools have a directive leadership model versus a collaborative leadership where you say, how can I help you accomplish your goals? And so, you can look at different kinds of leadership styles in their application. A lecture, a test, a graded paper is directive or transactional. Transactional is I'm going to bribe you. If you do a good job on writing my paper, I'll give you a gold star and an A. What it's good for predictable process improvement. I can't ever make you be innovative using a lecture or test or graded paper, but I can teach you little tiny things that you can do. So the impact and the result is very, very short term, and it's effective in the short term, which is why a lot of schools use it, but it's really, really bad in the long term. In fact, it often has the opposite effect. What I demand that you do right now, you'll grow to hate and resent and figure out reasons why it was a mistake in the long term. Simulations in labs, type of leadership called directive, collaborative, and participative. Pretty good for applicable skills and conviction. I learned why some things are important, a good long term. And then really, if you want to get this discovery and ownership of new ideas, then you need things like microcosms and real-world projects. This is a form of leadership called collaboration and participative, and that is the only thing that has very long-term results. So can I teach you leadership? No, but I can teach you mistakes in leadership. And again, the notion of understanding different leadership techniques is one of the great failings of school. And again, I think we're just starting to get a hint of that. And again, if you want to read more about this, then some of the best stuff has been done from Gary Uckel. So one other aspect here, as we sort of, again, schools are just starting to realize what unschoolers have already known. Learning requires emotions. Excellent, Allison, thank you. Learning requires emotions. In order to learn anything, your brain simply needs some chemicals. Learning does not happen unless there's emotions. Now, the real tragedy is fear is the MSG of emotions in school. Fear is cheap and easy. I can make you afraid if I'm a teacher. If you don't do what you're supposed to do, you're going to fall behind. All your peers will think you're stupid. You won't get a job. You won't have a life, blah, 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 blah. The reason every single one of us crammed for tests in school, every single one of us, no matter how good of a student we were, we crammed for tests. Well, why do we cram for tests? We're all smart. We all know that cramming is painful and frustrating. Why do we cram for tests? The reason we did it is because we were ginning up our own emotion, in this case, fear. We cram for tests because we can only learn anything when there's emotions. We don't care about the material we're given in most school contexts. If we get afraid, if we gin up our own fear, if we put ourselves in a panic mode, then that panic will help us learn the materials in the short term, enough to write it down on a test and get a good grade. I'm sure most of us got very good grades. But it has at least two impacts. A is we don't remember it for very long. We have no conviction around the material itself. And also, eventually over time, we start actually showing signs of post-traumatic stress. And I do believe if you look at a lot of students, especially those who go on to graduate school and get their PhDs, they still exhibit post-traumatic stress symptoms decades past the fact they had their diploma. I know one PhD who kept his diploma above his bed because he woke up in cold sweat almost every other night thinking that he was failing out. Fear is not epiphenomenal. Fear is a direct input that is used in most school systems today as a substitute for much more authentic emotions like enthusiasm, excitement, passion, whatever. Lots of the unschooling philosophies fall into this category of, I haven't really given it any thought, but let me think about it, but just not right now. One of them, again, creating these periods of reflection. Learn something because you need it or because you love it. A really important concept of learning. And by the way, you teach each of them differently. If you need something like reading, writing, and arithmetic, again, ideally you teach everything in the context of love it. Let's take what you love and we'll teach you everything around it. If you're clever over time, we can teach you the important things that we think you have to know in the context of things you love. Realistically, there may be some things that fall through the cracks, in which case we now need to shift to a more directive mode in order to force some kids' things to be learned. One of the things here, too, is animals are better than books about animals. One of the great traumas of education today is, again, this is a variation of "This Is Not a Pipe," the famous French painting. Once we start confusing symbolism and representations of reality with reality, and this is a problem I actually face all the time building simulations and serious games, once we start confusing those, we get into a lot of trouble. We do have to, and again, if you're a factory, you hate this. If you're a school, you hate this. But the reality is that reality is interesting. Reality is fascinating. Reality develops passions and interests in a way that books and texts and lectures simply cannot. So we need to constantly fight our own desire to over-sanitize things, to make things more efficient, less messy, because in this environment, in this messiness, things are learned. When I was interviewing John Seeley Brown, who used to be the chief scientist at Xerox's Park facility, that ultimately created things like the mouse and Ethernet, he certainly acknowledged that up until high school, he learned a lot more about physics by going outside and fixing his lawnmower than he ever did in class. Now, obviously, at some point, his own experience couldn't keep up with the environments the schools afforded him. But, it's this notion of things get learned in reality. When you talk about, leadership and project management, relationship management, can you teach those? Maybe, maybe not, but certainly you need to create very authentic environments to allow those skills to evolve on its own, to hit that evolutionary and genetic learning model we talked about earlier on. The notion of including meaningful work. Meaningful work, how do I help you? Meaningful work is not drawing a butterfly picture to put on the refrigerator. Meaningful work is if I'm an old person helping me with my groceries, or in this case, helping me set up a blog page or deal with Facebook. Unschooling rule number one, first thing when I was interviewing all of these homeschoolers and unschoolers, there are three types of learning. Learning to know, which is what schools are really good at. Learning to be, who am I? Learning to do, how do I do things I couldn't do before? And again, any kind of good school curriculum has all three of those. This is a concept that is just starting to bubble up. Finally, there's all these unschooling rules that I put into the crazy talk category. These are things that homeschoolers and unschoolers have already discovered. Yeah, thank you, Allison. These are all things that homeschoolers and unschoolers have already discovered that schools are not even close to figuring out. Parents care more than any institution about their children. Schools continue in a way that's really absolutely horrible. If you listen in on school conversations of teachers off hours, a lot of time they spend saying, let me tell you about bad parents. Let me tell you about this one parent who couldn't even do anything. Let me tell you about this other kid who is a professional, who was so busy with their career they never helped their kids, whatever. The amount of anti-parent conversation that happens in a lot of the back rooms of most schools is really, really offensive to me as a human being, and it's something that we've let schools sort of percolate on their own. That the notion that parents are the enemies in any kind of framework is absolutely counterintuitive. Ideal class size isn't 30 or 15, but more like 5. That sounds crazy, but it actually is something that can be worked through. Expose more, teach less. Exposure in a lot of cases is more important. Minimize the drop-off. One of the big unschooling rules that, again, a lot of you all know about that schools are starting to figure out is increasing exposure to non-authority adults. A lot of adults have their own passions. They don't want to be put in the position of babysitter, but they do want to share their experience with kids. And so, something that all homeschoolers and unschoolers do who are successful is how do we get non-authority figure adults to share their knowledge and passion. We don't want to put them in charge of our kids, but we do want them to overlap and agree with them. Use better models in classrooms. Again, Allison, you mentioned how do you teach leadership? Well, you have all of these techniques out there, from music and art class to improv, to book clubs, to writing groups, garage bands, movie making, startup businesses, World of Warcraft, Facebooks, 4-H, Future Farmers, summer camps, YMCA, internships and volunteering, family trips, pickup sports, organized sports, self-study, whatever. There's so many models out there that are better than classrooms. And again, so how do we get kids spending more time in all of these kinds of environments and less so in a traditional school? Again, family trips. How many teachers work hard to talk a family out of going on a trip or taking their children out of school for a week to go on a family trip? Again, you mention that to most teachers and they go ballistic. I don't care if you're going to Delft, the Netherlands, and looking around their culture. It is much more important for your son to be, spend a week in class. And again, that just, to me, is such a good symptom of that we're just totally insane. So the big conclusion here, the big aha, is the big conclusion of a lot of the homeschoolers, unschoolers that I was interviewing and talking to is literally education is individualistic. Easy to say, let me explain a little more. That every single person has skills that they are better at than anyone else in the world. Okay, that we are all better at some things than other people in the world. We also have beliefs and passions. There are some things that bother us more or get us excited more. So we all have individual skills that are different from everyone else. We all have beliefs and passions that are different from everyone else. And the goal of education, the only goal of education in my mind, is to align what we're best at with what we care most about through a series of projects where we can test and hone and explore, and then careers where we can actually be self-sustaining by doing it. This is the only goal of education. For a good life, align what you are doing with what you do well, with what you want to do, with what you think is important to do in a growing and sustainable way. Okay, that is the goal of education. And it's different for every single person. In some cases, someone might be very good at biology, love animals, explore through 4-H and become a veterinarian. For other people, they may be great at math and logic. They really have a problem because a lot of great people can't find meaningful work. Through programming assignments, start a software company that allows this to happen. So this is the point and the only point of education. Anything that does not support this inherent model, which in this case is mostly schools, is going to come up against problems. Anything that does support this, again, this is the sailing with the wind behind you as opposed to in a canoe with a fork trying to paddle. This is the model of how all education has to be structured, and as long as we're fighting against that, we're doomed. The corollary, frankly, is what we have today. The corollary is education is not, and it's not quite the definition of corollary, but education is not individualistic, in which case education is a lottery. If your skills and interests line up with schools, then you win. If they don't line up, you lose. And so schools do provide plenty of winners, but just a lot more losers, as they're designed to do, and it's right now a hugely problematic and immoral system. And so the question becomes constantly, how do you get there? So once again, I'm going to sort of end on where I started off with, which is saying, no, we're not going to ever have, nor should we ever have, a model where everyone unschools and homeschools. Schools will always be around, because they have the killer app of daycare, which is incredibly important for a lot of people, and important meaning useful, not necessarily because it actually is important. But in order to get to the future of education, there's no question that these two communities are going to have to come closer together. And by the way, the knowledge transfer is going to be that way. Schools have to learn a lot more about unschooling and unschooling principles. How do we teach outside of these weird artificial constraints of the factory floor, today's education system, in order to evolve to a much richer, much more dynamic future of education system. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very, very much, Clark, and thanks to everybody.